This is the third lecture on circulatory response to exercise. Blood consists of plasma, which is the liquid portion, which contains ions, proteins, and hormones. Blood also contains formed elements. These are cells, such as red blood cells, which contain hemoglobin to carry oxygen, white blood cells, which are important for preventing infection, and platelets, which are cell fragments that are important in blood clotting. One important characteristic of blood is the hematocrit. That's the percentage of the total blood volume that is packed red blood cells. As you can see in this figure, about 42% in this particular example is packed red blood cells. The way this was done is blood was put in a centrifuge. It's centrifuged, and the heavier elements, which would be the formed elements, which would be the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, have all ended up at the bottom. And at the very top is this yellowish fluid, which is the blood plasma. The average hematocrit for an adult male is 42%. The average hematocrit for an adult female is 38%. Hematocrit's important because it makes, so the red blood cells make the blood viscous, which actually increases the amount of work that the heart has to do. There are advantages to having a high hematocrit, because in principle you'd have more red blood cells with more hemoglobin and more oxygen carrying capacity for the blood. But the disadvantage is the blood becomes more viscous, and that makes essentially more work for the heart. There's a lot of interest in sports with training at high altitude. The idea is that when you go from a low altitude to a high altitude, this stimulates the production of a hormone called erythropoietin, which is generated by the kidney. And what this does is it stimulates the red bone marrow to generate more red blood cells. And this will then increase the hematocrit. So the idea is that this will then increase the carrying capacity of blood for oxygen, and it does. But at the same time, there's a disadvantage, which is it makes the blood a bit more viscous, and that makes it a little bit harder for the heart to pump the blood. In order to understand how blood flows in our body, we need to understand the relationship between pressure, resistance, and flow. Blood flow is directly proportional to the pressure difference between two ends of a system. So, for example, if we take a very simple system, such as a tube, we'll have a pressure such as P1 at one end and a pressure P2 at the other end. The difference is a delta pressure. So imagine, for example, if the pressures were the same, then there would be no pressure difference, and therefore there would be no blood flow. If the pressure is higher at P1 than P2, then you'll have flow. So blood flow is directly proportional to the difference in pressure. So if I double the pressure difference between P1 and P2, then the blood flow would be double. So blood flow is defined as the volume of blood per unit time flowing through the tube past a certain point. Now, the other important parameter is resistance. So again, if we have this tube, we have a certain pressure difference, we would get a certain blood flow. If we have a tube of a smaller diameter with the same pressure difference, well, there's more resistance to flow in this tube, and therefore the blood flow would be decreased. And so mathematically, the way this works out is that if you say double the resistance, then you'll have the blood flow. So you can see resistance is in the denominator of this equation. Using this equation, we can now look at how blood flows within our systemic circulation or systemic circuit. So the driver of this flow is the mean arterial pressure. And that mean arterial pressure is generated at the level of the left ventricle. And so it's the pressure you could, for example, measure in the aorta. And that pressure is roughly about 100 millimeters of mercury. Now, as the blood travels through the systemic circuit, the pressure goes down. By the time the pressure the blood enters the right atrium, the pressure is effectively about 0 millimeters of mercury. It's slightly higher, but only by a few millimeters of mercury. So we generally just consider it to be about 0 to make the math a bit easier. So essentially we have this delta P then of about 100 millimeters of mercury. So that we can put in here as our mean arterial pressure, and that's going to affect blood flow. The higher the pressure, the greater the blood flow. So this is why pressure is so important. Pressure is necessary for the perfusion of organs. So if our blood pressure drops too low, this will decrease blood flow. If it's too high, it may increase blood flow or damage organs. Now, the other big parameter that's important here is resistance. So resistance, as I showed previously, is dependent on the diameter of the blood vessels. And so by changing the diameter of blood vessels, the body can change blood flow through various organs. The resistance to blood flow depends on the length of the vessel. So for example, if we double the length of a vessel, then the resistance will be doubled. It also depends linearly on the viscosity. So if the viscosity of the blood is doubled, then the resistance would double. It depends on the radius of the blood vessel raised to the fourth power. So this means that there's a really large influence of radius. So again, we've talked about the fact there's smooth muscle associated with certain arteries, like the muscular arteries, which distribute blood to the various organs right before the arterioles, and the arterioles are blood vessels that have smooth muscle associated with them. So those blood vessels are able to change their radius due to vasoconstriction and vasodilation. And even relatively small changes in radius will have a very large effect on the radius through those smaller muscular arteries and through the arterioles. Okay, so sources of vascular resistance. As I said, mean arterial pressure decreases throughout the systemic circulation. By the time it reaches the right atrium, it's approximately 0 millimeters of mercury. The largest drop in blood pressure occurs across the arterioles. And for this reason, arterioles are sometimes referred to as resistance vessels. So it's really two reasons. One is that these are smaller in radius, and therefore there's a lot of resistance. And also because these have smooth muscle associated with them, they're able to modify or change that resistance. In this figure, you can see that the pressure within the left ventricle varies tremendously from about 120 millimeters of mercury during systole, and it drops tremendously during diastole. Within the aorta and the other large arteries, it varies between 120 during systole and 80 during diastole. Now, by the time you get to the arterioles, this variation in pressure starts to die down. So you're getting to more just a fairly constant pressure. By the time you get to the next level, just at the level of the capillaries, there are precapillary sphincters, which we'll talk about more in a second. There's almost no variation in the capillaries. It's relatively just a smooth pressure pushing the blood forward. By the time you get to the venules, which are very small veins, the pressure drops even more. And by the time we get to the large veins, we're roughly almost at about just barely above 0 millimeters of mercury. So what you can notice here that the point in which the blood pressure really starts to drop off is at the level of the arterioles. And again, that's going to be why they're considered the resistance vessels. The take-home message is that blood is composed of two principal components, plasma and formed elements. The formed elements are made up of cells as well as platelets. Blood flow through the vascular system is directly proportional to the pressure at the two ends of the system and inversely proportional to the resistance. The most important factor determining resistance to blood flow is the radius of the blood vessel, and the greatest vascular resistance to blood flow is offered in the arterioles. Oxygen demand increases tremendously during exercise. It may increase by a factor of 15 to 25-fold compared to rest. And this demand is highest, or the change in demand is highest in trained athletes. They can increase the overall oxygen consumption of the body by more than just a non-trained person. This increased O2 delivery is accomplished by increased cardiac output. So recall that cardiac output is the product of stroke volume multiplied by heart rate. And so those will increase, and we'll look into that in a few slides later. And there's also a redistribution of blood flow. So, for example, when you're exercising, there are some organs that will become less active and others will become very active. So, for example, skeletal muscle will become extremely active. And so there'll be more blood flow to skeletal muscle and less to internal organs such as the stomach and small intestine and so forth. There are a couple different ways in which cardiac output can increase. One is an increase in heart rate. And so most of us are quite familiar with this. This is actually one way we can judge the intensity of exercise. And you may be familiar with this formula. For young adults, you can take the maximum heart rate to be 220 minus the person's age. So, for example, a 20-year-old would have a maximum heart rate of 200 beats per minute. For adults over 40 and for younger children, there's a different formula it's a bit more accurate, which is to take the maximum heart rate to be 208 minus 0.7 multiplied by the age in years. So in addition to changes in heart rate that occur to exercise, there can also be increases in stroke volume. And I'll show a graph of this a few slides later, but there's an increase in stroke volume that occurs initially during exercise as the exercise intensity increases. But then by the time you get to about 40 to 60% of VO2 max, there's a plateau and stroke volume doesn't increase in most individuals. Now, in really highly trained subjects that are good at aerobic exercise, this plateau doesn't exist and they can continue to increase their stroke volume even as the intensity of exercise increases. As I mentioned, the stroke volume reaches a plateau in most individuals at 40 to 60% of VO2. And the reason for this is that higher heart rates, the filling time is decreased. In other words, the diastolic time is decreased and relative to the full cardiac cycle. And so because a lot of the filling of the ventricles is passive, meaning it's due to pressure of blood returning to the heart, entering the atria, and then entering into the right and left ventricles, this decrease in heart, this very high heart rate means that there's a shorter period of time for diastole and for this filling of the ventricles. So this then leads to a decreased end diastolic volume, and logically, if the end diastolic volume is reduced, then the stroke volume will be decreased also, because there's essentially less fluid in the ventricles for the ventricles to push against during the ejection phase. Now, interestingly, stroke volume doesn't plateau in highly trained individuals, and the reason is they seem to have improved ventricular filling, so they are able to increase their end diastolic volume and stroke volume even at high heart rates. Another parameter that changes when there's high oxygen demand by the body is what's called the arteriovenous difference, which is sometimes referred to as the A minus VO2 difference, where this V stands for venous oxygen content and the A stands for arterial venous content. And this can be, for example, quantified as the amount of O2 that's taken up from 100 milliliters of blood. This value increases during exercise due to higher oxygen uptake in tissues. So, for example, if we look at skeletal muscle, there's a very high need for oxygen for oxidative ATP production. So this means that the skeletal muscles use up so much oxygen when they're actively exercising that they have a decreased partial pressure of oxygen, which essentially means there's less oxygen in them. And this relative to the blood, the partial pressure of oxygen within the capillaries that are feeding the skeletal muscle. So when there's a large difference in partial pressure, then there's a very faster diffusion. There's an increase in the diffusion rate. And so for this reason, oxygen can leave the blood plasma and enter into the skeletal muscle, where it's then used up and converted essentially into water as the oxygen accepts electrons and also a hydrogen atom. So this can be quantified with what's called the Fick equation. This equation gives us the relationship between cardiac output, which is Q, this difference between the arterial oxygen content of the blood and the venous O2 content of the blood. And it relates it to VO2, which is the overall oxygen consumption of the body. So you can see here the oxygen consumption of the body equals cardiac output multiplied by, in parentheses, this arterial oxygen content minus the venous oxygen content. In order to better understand this equation, what I've done is I've sort of presented it in a slightly different way. So we can think of the amount of oxygen that's delivered to the body, and we're talking about the systemic circulation. So we would have cardiac output. So that's the output from the left ventricle in volume per unit time. And we could multiply that by A, which is the O2 content of the arterial blood. So it's the amount of oxygen per unit volume of blood. So that will in fact be the amount of oxygen delivered per unit time to the body. And then we could also think of this, you can also think about the amount of oxygen that comes back. Of course, tissues in your body don't use up every last bit of oxygen within the blood. So there is some venous O2. There's a certain venous oxygen content, which is VO2. So if we take the cardiac output, which again is a volume of blood per unit time, and multiply that by the amount of oxygen per unit volume of blood, then we'll actually have the amount of oxygen returned to the right atrium. So it's the amount of oxygen per unit time returned to the right atrium. So the amount of oxygen used by your body, consumed by your body, has to be the difference between the amount of oxygen delivered to the tissues and the amount returned to the body. So basically VO2, the total consumption of the body, is O2 delivered minus O2 to the body through the systemic circuit and O2 returned to the right atrium. So then we can just substitute these parts in here. So VO2 equals Q, which is cardiac output, multiplied by the arterial oxygen tension, minus Q, which is the cardiac output multiplied by the venous O2 content. So notice that we can pull Q out here, right? So we can pull Q out and multiply it by A minus VO2. And so that's the original Fick equation right there. So that's the derivation of this equation. This graph shows some of the changes that occur during exercise. As we increase VO2 max from, say, 25 up to 100%, you'll notice that the mean arterial pressure increases steadily. Notice that the diastolic pressure doesn't change very much, but the systolic pressure can increase quite a bit. Note that it increases from, I don't know, about 120 up to roughly about 200 millimeters of mercury. At the same time, we talked about the stroke volume increasing. So it does increase initially, but then somewhere around 40% VO2 max to 60%, there's a plateau, and it won't increase in most individuals. And as I explained earlier, the reason for that is there's limited time during diastole for the ventricles to fill. Cardiac output, which is the volume of blood per minute, increases fairly steadily. Note that it's not perfectly linear. It increases initially, and then it doesn't increase quite as fast. And that's probably because the stroke volume doesn't increase beyond about 40 to 60% of VO2 max. The heart rate increases pretty linearly as you increase the intensity of the exercise. And finally, the arterial venous O2 difference, which is an indication of how much blood is being extracted by the tissues, that increases initially quite quickly, and then it continues to increase. And I explained this earlier, but just to reiterate, the reason for this increased extraction of oxygen is because as the tissues of the body use up more oxygen, in particular, we're talking about skeletal muscle, the partial pressure of oxygen within the skeletal muscle decreases and relative to the partial pressure within the capillaries feeding them. and therefore there's a greater rate of diffusion of oxygen into the tissue. During exercise, there's a redistribution of blood flow. There's increased blood flow to working skeletal muscle. At rest, 15 to 20% of cardiac output goes to skeletal muscle. During maximal exercise, this value increases to 80 to 85%. At the same time, there's a decrease in blood flow to less active organs such as the liver, kidney, and GI tract. The splanchnic circulation refers to blood flow to viscera. As you can see in this diagram, during exercise, as the percent VO2 max increases, there's a decrease in splanchnic blood flow. At the same time, there's an increase in muscle blood flow. In this diagram, you can see the redistribution of blood flow during exercise. Note that initially this person is resting, and so they have a cardiac output of 5 liters per minute, which is typical for an adult. During exercise, this value increases by a factor of about 5 to 25 liters per minute. If we look at the percentage of blood flow to various organs, you see that at rest, about 20 to 25% of the blood flow goes to the viscera. During exercise, this value drops to 3 to 5%. At rest, about 4 to 5% of blood flow goes to the heart. That remains the same. Of course, you can note here that the overall blood flow is increased by about 5 times. So this means there's actually about 5 times more blood flow to the heart during exercise. Blood flow to the kidney is normally about 20% at rest. During exercise, it drops to only 2 to 4%. Blood flow to bones is 3 to 5%. This drops to a lower value. Blood flow to the brain is 15%. This drops to 3 to 4%. But remember that you have to multiply this value by 5 to get the actual absolute value. So it's really about the same. In fact, it might be slightly increased during exercise. So this is another reason why exercise is good for your brain. It increases, it actually slightly increases your blood flow to the brain, which is always a good thing. Blood flow to the skin is 4 to 5% at rest. It's not shown here, but for light to moderate exercise, the blood flow to the skin actually increases, particularly after you've been exercising for a while, because now there's a need for to dissipate heat that's been generated by all the muscles. For very strenuous, high-intensity exercise, the blood flow to the skin is not that high. And then finally, if you look at the skeletal muscle, it's 15 to 20% at rest, and it goes to 80 to 85% of the total blood flow during exercise. During exercise, there's vasoconstriction to visceral organs and inactive tissue. Vasoconstriction is caused by the sympathetic nervous system, and blood flow is typically reduced to about 20 to 30% of the resting value. At the same time, during exercise, the skeletal muscles show increased blood flow due to vasodilation of arterioles, and as well as precapillary sphincters, which I'll show you a picture of in a second. And this is due to a phenomenon known as autoregulation. In other words, this term means that blood flow increased to meet metabolic demands of specific tissues. For example, even as you're exercising, you may be using certain muscles and not others. And so instead of just generally sending blood to all skeletal muscle of the body, you'll see this is a phenomenon that leads to more blood flow specifically to the muscles that need the extra blood flow. Autoregulation occurs at the level of arterial smooth muscle as well as precapillary sphincter smooth muscle. So if you look at a capillary bed, you'll notice that it's fed by very small arteries called arterioles. And in this diagram, you can see that these arterioles are completely covered in smooth muscle. And usually that smooth muscle is about 1 cell layer thick. Occasionally, it may be as much as 2 cell layers thick. But that allows for vasoconstriction of the arterioles. And there's actually the arteries that feed into the arterioles also have smooth muscle. They're called muscular arteries or distributing arteries, and they have some smooth muscle also. So there is some regulation at the level of those small arteries also. Once you actually get into a capillary bed, notice that there aren't a smooth muscle is not associated with the capillaries themselves. These are very simple. They have a layer of endothelial cells and a bit of basement membrane, which is an acellular matrix of collagenous fibers and so forth. But there are leading into the capillaries, there is smooth muscle, and this smooth muscle makes up what are called precapillary sphincters. And so imagine this is skeletal muscle that's being actively exercised. There'll be a decrease in oxygen within the capillaries, an increase in CO2, a decrease in pH. There'll be all sorts of different changes that are occurring at the level of the capillaries. And they will, the capillaries and the local tissue around the capillaries will detect these changes, and they'll start to release vasodilators that act in a local region, the local region. So these will be chemicals such as nitric oxide, which is a signaling molecule, prostaglandins, ATP, adenosine, etc. So there will be a whole host of local signaling molecules, and they'll act on the arterioles, which are a very short distance away, as well as these precapillary sphincters. And so, for example, if this was active skeletal muscle, there would be the release of a whole host of these different signaling molecules, and that would lead to vasodilation and increased blood flow. Nitric oxide is one of the most important vasodilators. It's produced in the endothelium and in tissues that are slightly hypoxic, and therefore it acts then on the precapillary sphincters as well as the smooth muscle of the arterioles. It promotes smooth muscle relaxation. This results in vasodilation and increased blood flow. It's important in autoregulation together with other local factors. Together, these various factors work together to increase muscle blood flow during exercise. Oxygen delivery to exercising skeletal muscle increases due to an increase in cardiac output and a redistribution of blood flow from inactive organs to contracting skeletal muscle. Cardiac output increases as a linear function of oxygen uptake during exercise. During exercise in an upright position, stroke volume reaches a plateau at approximately 40 to 60% of VO2 max. Therefore, at work rates above 40 to 60% VO2 max, the rise in cardiac output is due to an increase in heart rate alone. During exercise, blood flow to contracting muscle is increased and blood flow to less active tissues is reduced. Regulation of muscle blood flow during exercise is primarily regulated by local factors. This phenomenon is called autoregulation. Autoregulation refers to intrinsic control of blood flow by changes in local metabolites. For example, changes in oxygen tension are detected, changes in pH, potassium, and so forth. Adenosine also, and nitric oxide around the arterioles. The next topic is the circulatory system's responses to exercise. There are changes in heart rate and blood pressure that depend on aspects of exercise such as type, intensity, and duration. One example would be arm work leads to a greater increase in blood pressure and heart rate than leg work. And we'll discuss why that occurs later. Environmental conditions can also have a huge impact on heart rate and blood pressure. So, for example, the same exercise done in a hot, humid environment will lead to a higher heart rate than in a cool environment. Doing a submaximal exercise in an emotionally charged environment will lead to a higher heart rate and blood pressure than it would otherwise. And this is due to an increase in sympathetic nervous system activity. So, of course, emotions can really get someone emotionally charged and increase that sympathetic nervous system activity. Also, emotions can lead to an increase in pre-exercise heart rate and blood pressure. Interestingly, if the exercise is maximal, such as a 400-yard a meter dash or something like that, then there's no difference in the peak heart rate or blood pressure. If exercise is relatively moderate, meaning that it's below the lactate threshold, then at the onset of exercise, there'll be an increase in heart rate, stroke volume, and cardiac output, as you can see here. And each of those will plateau relatively quickly within a few minutes. And then during recovery, again, if it's relatively moderate exercise below the lactate threshold, there'll be a decrease in heart rate, stroke volume, and cardiac output back towards resting levels, and that can occur relatively quickly. In contrast, if the exercise is much more intense, then reaching a plateau may take longer, and also the recovery may be much more lengthy than if it's a light or submaximal exercise. And so, of course, this has an impact on how you might train someone. Like, so for example, if you're doing lighter, more moderate exercise, they could do many bouts of exercise, whereas if they're doing more intense exercise, they would only be able to do a few bouts of exercise. I should mention that the environmental conditions also have an impact. So if it's a very hot, humid environment, that can also lead to a much longer recovery period. With incremental exercise, there's a linear increase in heart rate, and it's not shown here, but recall that the stroke volume increases up to about 40 to 60% of VO2 max, and then it plateaus. So recall that cardiac output is heart rate multiplied by stroke volume. So this plateauing of the stroke volume explains why the cardiac output increases, and then it with a certain slope, and then it increases with a lower slope. If the stroke volume plateaus, this further increase in cardiac output is going to be due to the increase in heart rate. There's also another way of looking at this, which is that recall that there was a second equation. Cardiac output is also equal to the pressure, MAP, divided by the vascular resistance, so the TVR, total vascular resistance. So as your book mentions, during exercise, there's a large drop in TVR, and that's because let's say this person's running or bicycling, there would be a large decrease in TVR due to the dilation of the arterioles in the legs, in skeletal muscle. And so that would also tend to increase the cardiac output. What else? So blood pressure increases, the mean arterial pressure increases, and that's entirely due to an increase in the systolic blood pressure because the diastolic remains constant. So one thing I want to mention is that this is the idea of a double product. So if we want to make some estimate of how much work the heart is doing, essentially the workload on the heart increases due to two things. It's going to increase due to the increase in the heart rate. So the number of beats per minute is going to certainly increase it. But then the second thing is it's essentially has to work against an afterload, or called the afterload, which is the mean arterial pressure. But another way of looking at this is instead of taking the mean arterial pressure, you can use the systolic blood pressure, because during ventricular systole or ventricular contraction, during the ejection phase, it's actually the systolic pressure that's important. That the heart will have to work against in terms of generating pressure to eject blood. And so this is just a rough estimate, but it's called the double product, and it gives you an idea of the workload on the heart. And to achieve that, you just simply multiply the heart rate by the systolic blood pressure. So this idea of a double product can be quite useful. For example, here we can see a person at rest has a certain heart rate. As they go up to VO2 max of 100%, their heart rate is increased to 200 beats per minute, and their systolic blood pressure has increased from 110 to 210 millimeters of mercury. So for example, it's roughly doubled. It's a little bit less than doubling. This is almost tripled. But if you look at the double product, you see that it's roughly 5 times higher. So this gives a better idea of how much work the heart is in fact doing by doing this product than if you were to take, say, the systolic blood pressure or the heart rate alone. So this idea of a double product could be clinically significant. So for example, if you knew that you had a patient that had heart disease or heart ischemia, and you didn't want them to work too hard and get to the point where their heart is metabolizing so much oxygen that you actually get into a risk of a heart attack, it might be good to look at something like the double product. You could say, well, here's the maximal heart rate you should have. Here's the maximal systolic blood pressure. And we know that's really the top value you should go to, because we only want you to say, go to a certain double product value. So an interesting result, which I mentioned earlier, was when you compare arm exercise versus leg exercise, given the same oxygen uptake, meaning the body's doing the same amount of work, arm work results in higher heart rate as well as higher blood pressure. And you can see that here in these graphs. Here are the exercise oxygen uptake values. Here's the blood pressure for leg exercise. Here's the blood pressure for arm exercise. It's clearly higher for arm exercise. And if you look at heart rate, the arm exercise values are higher than for the leg exercise. So the heart rate values are higher due to higher sympathetic stimulation. So it's not really clear why, but for some reason, arm exercise leads to more sympathetic nervous system activation than leg work does. And if we look at blood pressure, it's quite interesting. As I said, the blood pressure is higher with arm exercise. And actually, this is pretty well understood also. It's due to vasoconstriction of the large inactive muscle mass in the leg. So when someone's running or on a bicycle, their very large muscles, which are the muscles in their legs, are active. Those skeletal muscles will have increased blood flow due to dilation of arterioles. And so that will lead to a decrease in the total peripheral resistance. And so if you recall, MAP, mean arterial pressure, is simply equal to total vascular resistance, also referred to as total peripheral resistance, multiplied by cardiac output, right? So, and so if you think about this, if you have a lower peripheral resistance, then you'll have a lower blood pressure. When you're doing arm exercises, you don't have the benefit of all that blood flow through the capillary beds and so forth during the leg exercise. And so you don't get that large drop in total vascular resistance. And so that's why the blood pressure is higher. With intermittent exercise, the recovery of heart rate and blood pressure depend on various factors. One is the fitness level of the individuals. So in general, fitter individuals, their heart rates won't go all that high to begin with during the actual exercise. And so because of that, they'll recover faster. The same exercise, but done at high temperature and high humidity, is quite a bit harder, and part of the reason is because of the fact that the body will increase in temperature, and then there'll be a substantial recovery period just to offload all that heat. So that would limit the number of say, bouts of exercise that could be done in high temperature humidity. It could also limit the length of time or the how strenuous the exercise should be. And then, of course, the duration intensity of exercise also can change the recovery rate. So, for example, this is fairly obvious stuff, but with lighter exercise, the recovery time is much faster. During prolonged exercise, cardiac output may be maintained for the full duration of the exercise. So, for example, here it looks like it's about 100 minutes. What's interesting is there's often a gradual decrease in stroke volume. And this turns out to be due to dehydration and reduced plasma volume. So particularly on a very hot day when someone's sweating, there may be a significant decrease in plasma volume and corresponding decrease in venous return, and therefore also a decrease in stroke volume for the reasons we've discussed earlier. Now, to compensate for that, in order to maintain the cardiac output, then there will be like a gradual increase in heart rate during the prolonged exercise, particularly in heat. And these changes that occur slowly over time during these exercises would be referred to as cardiovascular drift. Take-home messages are the changes in heart rate and blood pressure that occur during exercise are a function of the type and intensity of exercise performed, the duration of the exercise, and the environmental conditions. The increased metabolic demand placed on the heart during exercise can be estimated by examining the double product. So recall that the double product is the heart rate multiplied by the systolic blood pressure. And so that gives a very good estimate of the amount of work the heart is doing. At the same level of oxygen consumption, heart rate and blood pressure are greater during arm exercise than during leg exercise, and that's because during arm exercise there's greater sympathetic activity. That increases the heart rate, and the blood pressure difference can be explained by the fact that during arm exercises, the leg muscles are inactive, and therefore the arterioles are not dilated, and the capillary beds going to the skeletal muscle in the legs, and therefore the total vascular resistance is maintained relatively high during this exercise. And that would lead to an increased blood pressure because the mean arterial pressure is equal to total vascular resistance multiplied by cardiac output. Finally, the increase in heart rate that occurs during prolonged exercise is called cardiovascular drift, and this occurs would be particularly pronounced in cases where the athletes are experiencing dehydration because of high heat. Tragically, occasionally there are sudden cardiac deaths among athletes. These are relatively rare events, so sudden cardiac death during exercise only occurs in about 1 in 200,000 youth athletes. In both youth, such as children and adolescents, as well in adults, it's typically caused by abnormal lethal heart rhythms. In children and adolescents, it can be due to genetic anomalies of coronary arteries, cardiomyopathy, which is a wasting of cardiac muscle due to disease, or myocarditis, which is inflammation of the heart. In adults, it's often due to coronary heart disease and cardiomyopathy. So these are preventable in the sense that a medical exam can identify those as at risk. This diagram summarizes many of the things we've talked about. We could look, for example, at cardiac output. Cardiac output is actually simply the product of cardiac rate or heart rate multiplied by stroke volume. So we can look at the things that actually affect cardiac rate. So the sympathetic nervous system releases norepinephrine at nerve terminals at the SA node, therefore affecting cardiac rate. It also releases norepinephrine directly at synapses on the cardiomyocytes of the ventricles, increasing contractility, and that would increase stroke volume. Now, the sympathetic nervous system also has hormones. It releases epinephrine and norepinephrine and epinephrine from the adrenal glands, which sit above the kidneys. And then these hormones also have the same effect. They would increase cardiac rate as well as stroke volume, again, through increases in contractility of the heart. The stroke volume is influenced by venous return. So remember, the average mean arterial pressure is about 100 millimeters of mercury, but the average venous pressure is very, very low, maybe only about 2 millimeters of mercury by the time you get back to the right atrium. In fact, it's so low, we could sort of consider it to be zero. Because it's so low, we have to rely on other means to get the venous return to occur. So one thing that we have are there's a skeletal muscle pump. And so when we have skeletal muscle activity in the arms and legs, that pushes blood that's in the venous system in the veins that are in these chambers formed by one-way valves. It generally pushes the blood back towards the heart. So we'll end up going towards the heart. So for example, if you're talking about blood coming from the legs, it would end up in the abdominal cavity. At that point, there's another pump, which is the respiratory pump that takes over. So as we breathe, particularly if you're breathing rapidly and deeply during exercise, then this will result in cyclical changes in pressure, such that the pressure in the abdominal cavity will increase relative to the pressure in the thoracic cavity. And the inferior vena cava has one-way valves, just like the veins in the arms and legs. And so this will act as a kind of pump, pushing the blood back towards the heart. With this improved venous return, you then have a larger end diastolic volume, which leads to an increased stroke volume. So let's look at some other things. So cardiac output increases the blood pressure. So mean arterial pressure is determined by two things. It's the product of the cardiac output and the total vascular resistance, or TVR. So if you increase in cardiac output, that'll increase the pressure, and that'll lead to more blood flow to the skeletal muscles. At the same time, your body relies on vasodilation. So we have local control of vasodilation, for example, in skeletal muscles. So skeletal muscle that's very active will have lower levels of oxygen, higher levels of CO2, a decrease in pH, and increase in potassium levels. So these are all essentially metabolic changes. And those can have a vasodilatory effect on the smooth muscle. But there's also the release of signaling molecules, such as nitric oxide. And those molecules will also lead to a vasodilation of the smooth muscle in the arterioles, as well as in the smooth muscle associated with the precapillary sphincters. And so those changes will lead to increased blood flow through skeletal muscle. And so you can see that here, this is leading to that. And then at the same time, you have the sympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for vasoconstriction in the viscera. So this would be your stomach and small intestine. And actually, the sympathetic vasoconstriction also extends to the large veins. Those serve as a kind of reservoir for blood. So during times when you need blood because of perhaps dehydration or blood loss, or even just during exercise, if you need to have an increased venous return, then the sympathetic stimulation of the smooth muscle associated with the major veins will also lead to increased venous or improved venous return, and therefore increased stroke volume.
One question that's puzzled physiologists studying exercise has been the rapidity of how quickly the system responds at the onset of exercise. In other words, imagine you have a person who's at a standstill and they suddenly jump on a treadmill and start running. Well, long before negative feedback mechanisms would have had time to sort of tell the person, oh, you need to increase your heart rate, you need to increase your respiratory rate, and so forth. Those things would have already happened. They'll ramp up actually relatively quickly to account for the fact that the person's being essentially went from completely resting to fairly intense exercise. And so what's emerged is the idea that in addition to negative feedback mechanisms, which are important, there's also an internal drive that comes from higher brain centers. So, and those are often going to be associated with, this drive is going to be associated with the centrally generated motor signals. In other words, there's part of your brain that generates the motor signals that go to your arms and legs as you're exercising. And so your brain, in a sense, knows it's exercising almost instantaneously. Okay, the arms are moving, the legs are moving. So why not use that information to rapidly increase heart rate, increase respiratory rate, and so forth? And in fact, that does seem to be the case. So there are there's this sort of central command that comes from these higher brain centers. Now, that's not to say that feedback's not important. So this increase in heart rate and so forth, increase in sympathetic nervous system activity, say a decrease in parasympathetic nervous system activity, are going to be fine-tuned from feedback from heart mechanoreceptors. So you have pressure receptors, for example, in the right atrium that will detect pressure there. That's a way of looking at venous return, blood flow return to the right atrium. You have muscle chemoreceptors. So, for example, in skeletal muscle can detect, there are cells that are able to detect increases in potassium, which would occur with exercise, increases in lactic acid, decrease in O2, increase in CO2. And so the general term for this sort of a reflex is an exercise pressure reflex. It means that these mechanoreceptors and these chemoreceptors are detecting changes, and they're going to send afferent input into the central nervous system, acting in a sort of negative feedback manner to do things like, for example, increase blood flow to certain muscles and so forth. So in addition to the chemoreceptors, we also have mechanoreceptors. So we have, for example, the muscle spindles. These detect changes in muscle length by looking at stretch. We have the GTO, the Golgi tendon organ, which detects muscle tension, and those are located within the tendons. And so these can detect the muscular movement, and again, of course, send feedback into the central nervous system, and that can interact with the central drive. And we also have baroreceptors. So we have these baro, remember, refers to pressure, as in barometric pressure. And so these are receptors, which are neurons that are sensitive to pressure. These are found in the carotid arteries and the carotid sinus on both sides of the neck, and also within the aorta. There are these aortic bodies that also have baroreceptors. And so these are sensitive to changes in arterial blood pressure, and these have a very profound effect on affecting the cardiovascular center within the brainstem. This is a summary of cardiovascular control during exercise. At the center of everything is the cardiovascular control center, which is located in the lower brainstem, which is called the medulla oblongata. Coming into this, we have information from the central command, which is higher brain centers. So this would probably be in the cortex of the brain. These areas of the brain are the areas of the brain that are actually sending out the signals coordinating muscular movement, say in the arms and legs. And so they'll send essentially kind of a copy, in a sense, of this motor output, saying, okay, there's a lot of motor activity going on. You should get ready for that. At the same time, the baroreceptors are going to detect mean arterial pressure. They have a large effect on the cardiovascular control center in the brainstem. Mechanoreceptors in muscles include things like muscle spindles and the Golgi tendon organ. There are a few other ones, such as mechanoreceptors that measure things like joint angles and so forth. They all send input to the cardiovascular control center. There are also chemoreceptors within skeletal muscle. These detect metabolic changes, such as low oxygen, high CO2, decrease in pH, increase in lactic acid, and so forth. And so they send input also, this is to the cardiovascular control center. And then the cardiovascular control center controls things like heart rate via the autonomic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system will increase heart rate as well as heart contractility. The parasympathetic nervous system has no direct effect on heart contractility, but it does affect cardiac heart rate. So it can slow it by the release of acetylcholine, which is inhibitory. The cardiovascular control center can also affect blood vessels. So, for example, and it mainly does this through the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system innervates many of the blood vessels in the body. So, for example, from venules, which are small veins, all the way up to much larger veins. So, and it can also send input to arterioles. And so one thing that happens, for example, during exercise is the sympathetic nervous system that innervates certain organs, such as the GI tract. And during exercise, it will release neurotransmitter, causing the contraction of smooth muscle in arterioles within the viscera. And so there will be less blood flow to the viscera. At the same time, there is, in fact, sympathetic innervation of arterioles going to skeletal muscle. But recall that in skeletal muscles, you have this other phenomenon called autoregulation. And so because of autoregulation, in the really actively working skeletal muscle, there'll be a vasodilation of the arterioles as well as the precapillary sphincters, and that will greatly increase the blood flow to the skeletal muscles during time of exercise. Finally, the sympathetic nervous system also sends input to the major veins as well as the venules. And the major veins in particular serve as kind of a blood reservoir. And so in times when you need a lot of venous return, increases in sympathetic activity will squeeze those blood vessels, and that will help to increase return of blood to the right atrium.